The media coverage of the conviction of Lucy Letby was a significant factor in the trial and certainly in the perception of the general public regarding Lucy herself. While numerous commercial outlets reported and wrote on the trial and everything surrounding her conviction, the BBC had a particularly central role. It's the BBC that people are most likely to watch in terms of news coverage. The BBC have the very privileged position of receiving the licence fee, so they can divert resources to a major story of this nature as they see fit. The BBC website is visited by basically everyone in Britain. I believe at one time it was said that, I can't remember if it was 95 or 98% of people use a BBC service every week or every day. And I think it's a very high percentage of people use the BBC website on a regular basis. Of course, I use it on a regular basis myself. The BBC also has a unique role as what is deemed to be a public service broadcaster. It has very strict rules related to impartiality and fairness. And while you would hope that commercial media would take its role very seriously as well, the BBC has a unique position, it's uniquely funded, it has a unique mandate. So in this video we're going to assess whether the BBC coverage of the Lucy Letby trial met its requirements as a fair and impartial public service broadcaster. The BBC operates under a royal charter, as you can see on the screen now, and that is renewed every 10 years. This latest one was issued in December 2016. It could be argued that as the BBC nears the end of its 10-year period and the ending of its particular period of being chartered, that it becomes a little bit nervous about that royal charter being renewed. As an initial criterion and requirement of receiving a royal charter, the BBC must be independent in all matters. So it cannot be party political, it shouldn't be partisan or partial in any way. Now, I'm sure that people that are familiar with the BBC, many people will consider that to be rather ridiculous and would treat the claim that the BBC is independent with derision. But that is nevertheless something the BBC is supposed to be. This is point 3 in the Royal Charter, the most recent one. Point 6 outlines the public purposes of the BBC. And just to reiterate, the BBC has an enormous responsibility to live up to these public purposes because it is publicly funded by the licence fee that no other media receives. Every other form of media in this country must survive commercially. It's only the BBC that receives £5 billion of public money every year, just paid out from people of modest means, the average man and woman in the street, essentially. So this public purpose is incredibly important. It is the sole justification for the existence of the BBC. And point 1, so the primary and most important point of the BBC is to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. The BBC should provide duly accurate and impartial news, current affair and factual programming. So that's very clear as to what they're supposed to do. They must remain impartial on any issue. I would argue an important part of that should be representing a wide parameter or wide range of views. I think the corporation singularly fails on that requirement, but that is not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to assess whether or not the BBC was fair and impartial in its coverage of Lucy Letby and whether it continues to be. So I found an article on Quora regarding the impartiality of the BBC. The question is simply, how impartial is the BBC really? There's a few answers I just wanted to highlight. First one here is by this guy, Bill Eason. It used to be, but now it's an organ of the state. The dependence on licence payer funding being routed through the government of the day gives that government too much power over the BBC. Neil Luckham, like every public broadcaster, it is not independent. It is dependent for its funding on the government and as such cannot seriously upset any government. It is also, like every UK broadcaster, subject to certain broadcasting standards. That's not as significant in my view. But it is reasonable. The comment he makes here about the BBC being held to higher standards, I'm not even sure that's true, but I think there is a kind of tacit acceptance that the BBC should be held to a higher standard. Whether it actually is, I'm extremely doubtful. And then Gabrielle Bell, who puts it more forcefully, if you are employed by someone who pays you billions of pounds a year, how independent would you be even if you claim to be entirely free of their control? If you ran a company but knew that at any moment someone could come and shut you down without warning, how independent of them would you be? If you ran a business and most of your board was made up of members of an organisation that you reported to, how independent would you be? The independence of the BBC is a joke. He did make another statement after that, but I've just edited that out because, although it was true, it was quite offensive. So the BBC, as we mentioned, they're coming up to the point where their licence fee is going to be renewed or not, as the case may be. So they would be very concerned about a research briefing such as this, which discusses the future of the BBC licence fee. Now, I'm not going to examine that in depth because it's not really the topic of this video. I'm just establishing the context. But what a lot of people don't know is that the existence and future of the licence fee is dependent on the Privy Council. Not often the Privy Council really gets discussed, but as mentioned here, the Privy Council, formerly His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, is a formal body of advisors to the Sovereign of the United Kingdom. Its members, known as Privy Councillors, are mainly senior politicians who are current or former members of either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. The Privy Council formally advises the Sovereign on the exercise of the royal prerogative. The King in Council issues executive instruments known as Orders in Council. The Privy Council also holds the delegated authority to issue orders to Council, mostly used to regulate certain public institutions. It advises the Sovereign on the issuing of royal charters, which are used to grant special status to incorporated bodies. And that is really what occurs in the case of the BBC. Now, I'm sure that you can probably tell from this information that it's not exactly common or garden people that are sitting on the Privy Council. So I have on the screen here a list of members of the Privy Council, which goes back, it includes pretty much every prominent person from politics who's been in a cabinet position and numerous other prominent individuals. So I'll just find, here's Kemi Badenoch on the list, current leader of the Conservative Party. Here's Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, and somewhere on here is Ed Davey, the current leader of the Liberal Democrats. So they're not necessarily currently sitting on the Privy Council, not really going to go into all of that, but there's a clear incentive here for the BBC to keep the government happy, to keep the establishment happy, to keep all the parties, not just, people always say, and you heard in even those Quora answers, the government at the time, but it's really just the government, who, it doesn't really matter whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government, because they will be represented on the Privy Council, and they will sit on the Privy Council, they will decide, are we going to give the BBC a royal charter? And if they don't give the BBC a royal charter, the licence fee is finished. So as a consequence of this, the BBC has become a narrower and narrower organisation in terms of its focus, and less critical, not only of the state, and not only of the government, and not only of the establishment, but anything that just might upset anyone that is even broadly affiliated with the government, or what could be described as the establishment. And they just take increasingly watered down positions on everything while pretending to be independent and impartial. And that really is a consequence of the funding, it's a consequence of the fact that the existence of the BBC, which is, it's been around for a very long time now, many decades, it's really under threat now because clearly there's no justification for the licence fee. Who the hell sits and watches TV in this day and age? But I won't dwell on this any further because I want to get into the actual Lucy Letby stuff, but I just wanted to provide this context before going any further. So I'm going to begin this by looking at the post-trial coverage of the BBC. So there's an article here where they just uncritically report the fact that she's been interviewed in prison. I think they actually did take the time to speak to Mark MacDonald here, although they didn't. They didn't really. They didn't. I don't think they printed his most critical comment, because he says here any allegations need to be taken seriously. So we are only surprised by the timing of this new leak from the police. So I don't think they actually report his most critical remark, which essentially, I remember him saying that he was very surprised about this. And of course, it's gone absolutely nowhere. It's not going to go anywhere. But they just report it as a valid or legitimate line of inquiry, essentially. So I'm going to leave the tabs at the top for this video and just keep switching between the tabs, because to do otherwise would take a lot of editing. So it's not going to be as aesthetically pleasing as the other videos, but we're going to be looking at a lot of BBC articles in this video. So here's another one. There's the fat lump of lard we're streeting. And here he is urging caution over the Clear Letby campaign. So this is, again, just reported completely uncritically. That's all there is to it. There's nothing here of any substance to say, well, maybe it's legitimate for people to be involved in the criminal justice system. Maybe it's legitimate for the public to hold the criminal justice system to account. Maybe it's legitimate for the public to engage in campaigns and activism. Of course, you would never see that from the BBC, because this is a member of the government, so they will just essentially repeat what the member of the government has said. If it was some sort of party political wrangle, then they would pretend to offer a balanced perspective, or they probably, or quite possibly would, offer a balanced perspective. But as this is a member of the government against the great unwashed, they just side with the government immediately. And then here, this is just an article puffing up Dr. Evans, who, made some comments, and they did at least repeat these claims. But yeah, so these are just three articles that either take an establishment position or are supportive of the prosecution position, and that has been their overwhelming position across their coverage since Lucy Letby was convicted. The BBC had to be dragged kicking and screaming into actually acknowledging that many people, including many credentialed people, have doubts, enormous doubts. Many now believe her to be innocent, of course. They were really, really reluctant to report that. But we'll be getting into that more as the video continues. So in the interest of balance, they did print this, so they did publish this article on Mark MacDonald's application to Criminal Cases Review Commission, and they did report on that, I suppose, reasonably. There is nothing particularly unreasonable about this article, except for some reason they give Hughes a platform, which I suppose is not an unreasonable thing to do. They quote that at great length, but overall this is a reasonable article. I can't be too critical. But really, there has been a reluctance to report anything. So here it's like there's this article about why the Letby case under more scrutiny than ever. And this does acknowledge that doubts over her guilt have been gaining traction thanks to her new legal team and high-profile supporters. The problem is that it's not really a supporter. It's not like a high-profile supporter. So David Davies believes that it's a miscarriage of justice. He's not supporting Lucy Letby. I think that's kind of a weaselly way of describing it. But anyway, that generally this is quite reasonable. But they really have. It's ironic, really, that they've said doubts over guilt have been gaining traction, because they've never gained any traction on the BBC. Because this remains pretty much the sole. They did make a second panorama that was a bit more critical, but this remains pretty much the only thing they've done, and it was very good. It was a very good programme. Credit to them. The people that worked on this programme did a great job. Of course, it was filed away on Radio 4 I believe on an afternoon. I can't remember when it was broadcast now. But more critical coverage of the Lucy Letby case, critical from the perspective of being critical of her, that's put in mainstream, that's put right on the centre of the website. Or, for example, they put the panorama out at 9 p.m. on BBC One, an absolute peak slot. They'll never do that with this until the verdict is overturned, and then they'll claim that they were the architects of it. And Judith Moritz will come out and say, "Oh, I was in court every day and I've been reporting about this for years," completely ignoring what her reporting has actually been like during that period. And in fact, they devoted half an hour here on the media show to the reporting of the Lucy Letby trial, which is just basically them congratulating themselves for spending some of the £5 billion they receive every year on sending someone to court. That's all. They devote as much time as that as they have to anything critical, really. Let alone all of the critical articles that have appeared quite prominently, very prominently, usually absolute headline news on the BBC website and in the news. So I think their post-trial coverage, while I will acknowledge they have made some form of token effort to acknowledge, eventually, I should mention as well, they were one of the last media organisations to do this. I said they had to be drag kicking and screaming. Virtually every commercial broadcaster, even going down to like the Sun newspaper, had printed better articles, favourable articles to the idea that it could be a miscarriage of justice, before the BBC eventually had to acknowledge that they couldn't just suck up to the establishment any further. There had to be a point where they said, yes, we acknowledge that people have doubts about this, even though that might upset someone. Because their primary purpose at this point in time is always to just make sure they don't upset anyone and just make sure they churn out this kind of pablum of mediocrity, and it's just a kind of inoffensive sludge is what they produce, just in the hope that they keep a low enough profile and they don't upset anyone, and no one in government or no one on the Privy Council or no one in a position of influence says, you know what, why does licence fee exist? People don't even watch TV anymore. Let alone should there be a licence for people to own a television and even to view services such as Amazon and Netflix and Apple TV that are not even affiliated with Britain. If you want to watch something on Netflix, you have to have a TV licence, which is preposterous because it's nothing to do with even Britain, let alone conventional television. And there's just clearly no justification for the licence fee. But of course, the BBC, what organisation wants to give up a guaranteed windfall of billions of pounds every year that they don't have to do anything for? Because we're going to see in this video, they don't have to be impartial. So what else do they have to do? It's not like if you go and look down the list of BBC One programming, you could do that for today. It's just antiques programs and like, oh, should we move to the countryside? Should we sell our house or should we do it up? Literally for hours and hours and hours. Then it's the news, which we know we're going to assess the quality of their news coverage of this case in this video. Obviously, we've already begun that process, but there just is no justification for the licence fee, clearly. However, that's absolutely fine. If they manage to achieve the licence fee again, that's not a problem. But if they're going to receive £5 billion of money, they should live up to the most important, number one requirement of the Royal Charter, which is for them to produce fair and impartial news coverage. So what I mainly want to do in this article is go through the BBC media coverage of the trial, and I'm going to go through the months of February and March. I have looked at every single article that the BBC published during the trial, and I'll get onto that as well. But it would take a very long time to go through every single article. So I'm just going to go, I'm not going to read these articles because, again, that would take an extraordinary amount of time. I'm just going to go through the headlines and I'll show you how much space is devoted to the prosecution and how much space is devoted to the defence in each article. So here the headline is Lucy Letby, baby had unusual skin modelling, trial hears. That's actually one of the more neutral headlines, but it's still saying there was something very unusual going on here. So the doctor saw unusual skin modelling on a baby girl. So it's immediately saying It's a doctrine, it's an appeal to authority. Immediately, this is favourable to the prosecution. So it goes on down here, and it goes on down here, and it goes on down here, and it goes on down here. Eventually, we get to Ben Myers. Your view is mottling normally means circulation is not as good as it should be. That's it, I think. That's it. So this is the defence here. Then it goes on. That's it. So 2/3 of this is the prosecution case. So let's go on to the next day, because we've got a lot of days to go through. Lucy Letby, nurse sent card to grieving parents, jury told. This is relatively neutral. I think this should honestly, to some extent, count in Lucy's favour. It's been twisted against her now. Somehow it's a bad thing that she did this, but in normal circumstances, this would seem to be an empathic thing, and I think at the time it should have counted in her favour, hopefully. So this is reasonably balanced. This is a reasonably balanced day's reporting. I can't criticise this. This is a reasonable article that shows a degree of balance. So I'll move on to the next day. Lucy Letby trial. Expert believes baby was given lethal air injection. So immediately, a medical expert said it stands to reason but cannot be proven that a premature baby girl's massive stomach was caused by a lethal air injection. And then this is all prosecution, all the way down here. Dr. Arthur's, prosecutor. Here we have Ben Myers defending. That's it, from the defence. The rest of this is all prosecution stuff. So I'll go on to the next day. Lucy Letby, doctor could find no clear cause for baby girl's death. A consultant paediatrician said he could not understand why a premature baby collapsed and died. Nurse Lucy Letby's murder trial has heard. So it's Dr. John Gibbs here. This is all prosecution stuff, all prosecution stuff, all prosecution stuff, all prosecution stuff. There's any defence here at all? No. So there's no indication of any defence here in this article at all. It just begins. It's exactly. I've mentioned in previous videos. It's the exact narrative that was used in court. Oh, a baby was absolutely fine, then it just collapsed for no reason. That is what is the narrative that's been put across in this article as well. And I must say, before I go any further, that to some extent the BBC reporting does reflect the one-sided nature of the trial itself. So that is one possible defence that you could put forward to the BBC. But we'll continue and go on to the next article. So this is on the 10th of February. They went a bit crazy on the 10th of February and published three separate articles. So this previous one's on the 9th. So on the 10th of February, they didn't do this on any other day, but for some reason on the 10th of February, they published 3 articles. So Lucy Letby, baby in extreme pain as she died, trial hears. So this kind of goes into the second category, where it's not just favourable to the prosecution, but also they use kind of emotional conditioning related to the trauma of infants as well. So in this case, the trial of nurse Lucy Letby has heard one of her alleged victims must have been in extreme pain at the time of her final and fatal collapse. So this is Dr. Sandy Bohin, so on it goes on, talking to Nick Johnson, on it goes on. And finally we get to the defence here. Cross-examined. So this is more of the defence here we've had on previous days, but it's not even a third of this article. So we'll move on to the next article, also on the 10th of February. Nurse murdered baby on 4th attempt, court told. Smiling nurse Lucy Letby offered to take photographs of baby girl soon after she allegedly murdered her at the 4th attempt, a court has heard. And so it goes on. And they managed to say she denied. Again, so I'm going to return to this use of the word denied later on. So here's the prosecution case. On it goes. The prosecution, Dr. Gibbs, Dr. Evans, blah, blah, blah. On we go. No defence here at all. Zero defence in that article. So we'll move on to the third article from the 10th of February. Lucy Letby, mother shocked at baby's collapse, trial hears. So again, this is feeding into the narrative of nothing. We couldn't believe the baby collapsed, and also the emotional blackmail almost of, the mother was really upset, understandably, that her infant had collapsed. So really playing on the emotions of the audience, essentially. The mother of a baby who was allegedly attacked by nurse Lucy Letby said she was totally and utterly just shocked when her infant collapsed suddenly. Again, it's reasonable to criticise the court case here, because I personally don't believe that the parents of the infant should have been in the court case, because how can they possibly be objective about this? The only reason for them to be in the court case would be if they'd seen something untoward. Naturally, if they'd seen something incriminating, then it's absolutely fine for their eyewitness testimony to be in the court, and it should be in the court. Given that no one saw anything, the fact that there was so much testimony from parents saying it was really, really upsetting, I personally believe to be completely unacceptable and something that just prejudices the whole process. Given that they have no medical expertise, they obviously can't be objective about very upsetting events related to their own children, and they don't have any medical information to convey. They didn't see anything by their own admission, and I just cannot see how that should be in the court case, and I cannot see what purpose it serves other than to sway the jury, which I believe to be completely wrong. Peter Hitchens wrote about how court cases shouldn't be predicated on emotion. They should be predicated on a surgical investigation of what occurred. I absolutely agree with that. We should get emotion out of the process as much as possible. That will lead to better decision making. And I just think this just simply shouldn't have happened. So also worth noting, this is about that Lucy was found not guilty on this count. Of course, the BBC weren't to know that at that time. So anyway, this was a child that had necrotizing enterocolitis and a perforated bowel. So they did actually manage to report that. Most of this is prosecution stuff still prosecution stuff. Yeah, so here we go. They did manage to get some defence in. It's right at the end. So what, 5% of the article, would you say, is a reasonable assessment? So we're on the 10th of February. We'll continue looking at February. So now we're on the 13th of February. Lucy Letby, baby making progress before collapse, trial hears. So again, this is clearly another headline that's favourable to the prosecution. A baby girl who was allegedly attacked by nurse Lucy Letby was making steady and encouraging progress before she collapsed, the court has heard. This is still child J. So it goes on. I can't see anything for the defence here at all. Certainly no mention of Ben Miser in this article. So that's 100% of the prosecution, really. There's nothing explicitly regarding to a defence in this article. So we'll move on to the next one. Lucy Letby, baby seizures did not happen naturally, trial hears. 2 seizures suffered by a baby girl did not happen naturally, nurse Lucy Letby's murder trial has heard. So we'll go through this. This is prosecution, still the prosecution, Dr. Evans, Johnson, the usual suspects. Anything from the defence? No. Nothing from the defence in that article. So we'll move on to the next day. 15th of February. Lucy Letby, mum prayed for baby after collapse, trial told. So again, very emotive headline again. The mother of one of nurse Lucy Letby's alleged victims has told the court she was calling on my God to save him after he suffered a sudden collapse. This is related to baby L and baby M here. So this is all prosecution, but this is less prosecution and more the prosecution trying to sway the jury by getting the parents on the stand and upsetting them. So there's nothing to the defence there whatsoever. Nothing. So we'll move on to the next day. 16th February. Lucy Letby, murder accused nurse breaks down at trial. Now, this could have actually been something that was favourable towards Lucy, but they had to describe her as the murder accused nurse. They couldn't just say Lucy Letby suffers distress and breaks into tears at trial. No, it's there to remind you that she's the murder accused nurse, obviously. Nurse Lucy Letby broke down in tears as a doctor began giving evidence at a murder trial. This is used against her. It was used against her in court. So far, this could have been favourable, but far from being favourable, they tried to use it against her. That's generally a fairly neutral article. Let's be fair. So move on to the next day. Lucy Letby trial told a battle to save her injected baby. So this is another emotive article. Doctors used 6 doses of adrenaline in a desperate 25-minute battle to resuscitate a baby allegedly attacked by nurse Lucy Letby. Her murder trial has heard. So again, it's just the heroic doctors did everything they possibly could to save this baby that that Lucy Letby allegedly attacked, according to her murder trial. So immediately they just see every article begins just by seeding your expectations immediately, and this whole thing is just an emotive stuff about this process that they've been through. There's a little bit on the defence here. I don't see anything else at all. So it's literally one again, less than 5% of the article. So move on to the 21st of February. Lucy Letby, medics fought to save baby boy, Letby trial told. So this is again the same thing. The heroic doctors did the best that they could when this child collapsed for no reason. A senior doctor was told the frantic battle to save a previously stable baby boy, allegedly attacked by nurse Lucy Letby. So we don't see Dr. Anthony Yuko mentioned very often, but he's speaking in this article, and so it goes on, and there's nothing for the defence there whatsoever. So let's move into the next day. So I might have put them in the wrong order. No, I haven't, because that was the 21st of February. This is 22nd of February now. Doctor had physical chill over baby events, trial told. I hope you're noting the nature of all these headlines. A doctor has told how a physical chill went down his spine when he realised someone could be injecting air into babies at the hospital where Lucy Letby is accused of murder. Dr. Ravi Jairam said he came to the conclusion after unusual, unexpected and inexplicable events at the County Chester Hospital. And so it goes on. So this is all Dr. Jairam, still Dr. Jairam, still Dr. Jairam. Here we go. Here's some defence. There's quite a bit in this one. This is as close as they've been to doing a balanced article, you could argue. But I still want you to have a look. There's more prosecution. I'd say here the defence might be 35 to 40% of the article. And they did actually print a reasonable degree of the defence here, having gone several days without writing a single word about the defence. So now we're on to 23rd of February 2023. Baby boy given noxious substance, nurse trial hears. Obviously, this was one of Dr. Evans' fantastic theories that later turned out to be complete nonsense. A baby boy's heart stopped beating after he was given a noxious substance or was injected with air. The trial of nurse Lucy Letby is heard. So again, this is another indication that Dr. Evans is changing his mind during the court case. We've already seen that when the BBC reported on this, they just interviewed Dr. Evans and then repeated completely uncritically what he said. They could easily have confirmed that he has changed his opinion. It wouldn't have been difficult, but no one does that at the BBC. All they do is they sit down and they think, what would be the least controversial thing we could say from the perspective of the establishment, the perspective of the court system, the perspective of the people we don't need to upset. And that's what they do every time. It's absolutely systematic. And I do believe that they recruit people that are favourable to that worldview, but I think there must be some conscious aspect to it as well. But I'll return to that later on. We're on the 23rd of February here, just to remind you. So this is all Dr. Evans telling about the baby, still Dr. Evans. Now we have some defence here. And this is reasonable. That's a reasonable passage that it does record Dr. Evans saying some strange things, though it obviously doesn't tell you that those are strange things. And then it goes back to the prosecution supporting the allegation. So this is at least 75% and possibly 80% prosecution. So we go on to the next day, 24th of February. Lucy Letby, baby's blood sugar dangerously low, trial told. A baby boy's blood sugar level dropped dangerously low after he received fluids contaminated with insulin, Lucy Letby's trial has heard. So this is all about stuff that I've discussed in a very recent video. Here's Professor Hindmarsh. This is all prosecution. Again, still prosecution. There's nothing from the defence there whatsoever. So we'll move on to the next day, 27th of February. Lucy Letby, baby girl's breathing tube interfered with, trial told. So if you noticed, all these headlines are just repeating claims from the prosecution. Nurse Lucy Letby allegedly tried to kill a premature baby girl within 2 hours of her birth, a trial has heard. So this is all just prosecution stuff down here, prosecution stuff. Nick Johnson prosecuting. So here, Ben Mai's defending previously told the court the probable cause for the tube dislodgement was the child inadvertently moving it herself. So there is actually a reasonable balance between those two statements, but most of this is a statement from the prosecution. There's more from the child's mother just to make you feel bad about the situation. Overwhelmingly, this is just about the prosecution case. So we'll move on to the final article from February, 28th of February. Doctors pressured not to make a fuss over Lucy Letby trial told. Oh, the heroic doctors wanted to get her off the unit, but they were told not to do so. Judith's writing this one, which is cute. A consultant has said that doctors were put under pressure by hospital management not to make a fuss when they raised concerns about nurse Lucy Letby. Says it's Dr. Jairam. Still the prosecution here. Still with the Crown alleges. More about the prosecution. More about the prosecution. More about the prosecution. More about the prosecution. That's it. So there's nothing there about the defence at all. So that's the end of February. So I will give my final conclusions at the end of this process, but I'm going to go through March as well. I mean, I've hardly got the will to do it, but I will go through all the articles that the BBC published in March. So we're going to go on to March now. So it begins with the 1st of March. Lucy Letby, nurse denied dislodging baby's breathing tube, trial hears. Now I'm going to discuss the significance of this word later on. I'm not going to dwell on this for the time being. But this is... there is some reasonable coverage of Lucy's defence to a certain extent, but it's all really been tainted here by the headline. But you could argue that this is a reasonably balanced article. So we'll move on to the next day, 2nd of March. Lucy Letby, dad found baby spattered in blood, trial hears. Obviously, this is another very emotive headline. Father was shocked to find his previously stable baby, the usual thing. With blood spattered around his mouth after he was allegedly attacked by Lucy Letby, a trial has heard. So this is, again, it's that thing of appealing to the emotion of the reader, very much what occurred in court. And this is all related to the parents and related to child and blood and so on. Looking for anything from the defence. They did manage to mention something here. 5% the article, let's be generous. Lucy Letby agitated by specialist arrival, trial told. So again, this is another negative headline about Lucy. Nurse Lucy Letby became agitated when a team of specialists arrived to help with the treatment of premature boy. Of course, that's an interpretation. She might not have been agitated at all. And this is... you wouldn't really say this is pro-prosecution. It's a bit of a nothing article, really. Well, I mean, a lot of the court case where they interviewed the nurses was not as eventful and not as important because they didn't see anything and they didn't have any suspicions and they didn't say anything bad about her. So that's obviously counts in Lucy's favour. So this article is pretty neutral, really. It's just a nurse. Where even is this agitated comment exactly? Oh, it's a doctor who said that. Yeah. A doctor who cannot be named for legal reasons told the court. I mean, can anyone be named in this court case? She remembered Miss Letby being agitated when a team of specialists from Old Hay Hospital arrived to help. She approached me a few times and said, "Who are these people? Who are these people?" Well, is that agitated or is it just a reasonable inquiry? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, that's a fairly interesting article. 6th of March, doctor saw blood in baby's throat, nurse trial told. So it's the heroic doctors again telling us that something awful has happened. Doctor saw blood and unusual swelling at the back of a baby boy's throat after he was allegedly attacked by nurse Lucy Letby, a court has heard. But I mean, pretty much every article begins that way, regardless of whether it's Daniel O'Donoghue or Judith Moritz. I mean, Judith said she was in court every day, did she not? Why didn't she write in the articles? Like, what's this guy doing now? Did you just turn up and just sit there and then go home? Anyway, blah blah blah. Doctor cannot be named. This is all the prosecution. It's all the prosecution. Here we go. Finally, we get to Ben Myers defending. So there's a reasonable amount here. Maybe we could say that's 20% of the article. Let's be generous. 80% is the prosecution. Then we'll go on to the next day. Lucy Letby, baby was heard screaming before collapse, jury told. So again, this is a combination of Lucy Letby's done something terrible and emotive stuff about the baby. And it's Daniel. Where's Judith? What's she doing? A baby boy was heard screaming after he was allegedly injected with air by nurse Lucy Letby. A court has heard. It's more about child N. Again, it's all the prosecution, Dr. Evans, blah, blah, blah. The Crown alleged that the bleed could have been the result of an inflicted injury. Here we finally get to Ben Myers again. There's a bit of a discussion here of Ben Myers and Dr. Evans, but I guess there's 25% if we're pushing it. I don't know to what extent. I guess this is just a record of the account, but I mean the comment, this cross-examination was a particularly ridiculous one. But yeah, it's really a prosecution favourable headline. 75% of the article's a prosecution. Parents beg for baby to be moved, jury told. This is an article that Judith's actually written this one, which is nice. This is another emotive one with the parents of baby triplets begging for the surviving son to be transferred after his two brothers died within 24 hours. And so it goes on with the parents. There'll probably be no defence in this article at all, which there isn't. So I'll move on to the next day. 9th of March 2023, nurse rejected baby move suggestion, jury told. So obviously Lucy Letby's done something wrong here. A nurse told jurors how Lucy Letby dismissed her concerns about a premature baby triplet who later died. And so it goes on. Nothing for the defence here. Oh, there is. Hold on. Stand corrected. There's 2 paragraphs at the end. Yeah. Lucy Letby, doctor asked for nurse to be taken off shift, court. So it's again the heroic doctor saving the day by telling Lucy Letby. It's Dr. Stephen Brary this time. On it goes with the prosecution case, the prosecution case, the prosecution case. There's a bit of Ben Myers defending here. I doubt that's 15% of the article. And I'll just go on to this article from March. It's the 15th of March. Lucy Letby, baby triplet died after trauma to liver, jury told. So I'm not going to go through the content of any more articles. I'll just show you the remaining headlines from March. So I'll just go through the headlines for the remaining days in March because I think you've got the general idea by now. 16th of March, Lucy Letby, unusual amount of gas in baby, trial hears. 20th of March, Lucy Letby, nurses' messages after baby deaths read to jury. 21st of March, Lucy Letby found caring for less sick babies boring, trial told. 22nd of March, Lucy Letby, doctors resisted nurses' frontline return, trial hears. 23rd of March, Lucy Letby, baby injected with fatal dose of air, jury told. 29th of March, Lucy Letby, baby suffered devastating internal injury, court hears. 30th of March, Lucy Letby, bruises on baby not caused by CPR, trial told. So this is the last one. Lucy Letby queried senior doctor's presence, trial hears. So those 2 months are particularly bad in terms of being weighted towards the prosecution. So I didn't pick those months purposefully. I just looked at the whole thing. I just picked 2 months that were together where there was a lot of reporting. This was 2 of the most prolific months in terms of the quantity reporting. As I mentioned, there was one day in which they published 3 articles on the same day, all of which were favourable to the prosecution, of course. And I think you would say overwhelmingly from these articles, this was not a balanced record of what occurred in court or a balanced record that attempted to convey the case for the defence as being equal to the case for the prosecution. Now, the BBC might claim that that was a reflection of the court process, but I don't think that's a reasonable claim, because there's an equal amount of time given in court to the prosecution and the defence. Ben Myers was on the floor for a quite significant period of time. He did put a lot of questions to these medics. As we will see when we go through some of the court, as much of the court transcripts as I possibly can in the months to come. So I don't think you can really make the claim that the articles here are a reasonable reflection of what occurred in court. They're very strongly weighted towards the prosecution case, and the headlines are particularly strongly weighted towards the prosecution case. So in the interest of being as complete as possible, I looked through every headline that the BBC published during the Lucy Letby trial, and I came up with these figures. I looked at these 4 categories: pro-prosecution headlines, emotional headlines regarding baby deaths, neutral headlines, and headlines that were favourable to Lucy. And I found that the majority were pro-prosecution, and over 2/3 of them were either pro-prosecution or kind of what I would describe as emotionally manipulative headlines. There was just over 10% that were neutral. Then they did have over 20% that were favourable to Lucy. I haven't examined the content of all those articles, but I've just looked at the headlines. Headlines are very important, as we'll move on to in a second. The thing that I would state, and that I should mention as well, is a lot of the articles that were favourable to Lucy came towards the end of the court case. The early to middle to late part was relentlessly pro-prosecution and relentlessly emotional. When Lucy came onto the stand, there were a few more headlines that were favourable towards her. I didn't read the full substance of those articles, but that kind of redressed the balance a little bit. But overall, you would have to say you're looking at over 2/3 that are very heavily stacked against Lucy, and around 80% is not favourable to her. And the favourable part only came after people had been battered over the head for month after month after month with pro-prosecution and emotional headlines about the babies. It could be argued by that stage that it didn't really make any difference what was printed, because a lot of people would have made up their minds already, I'm sure. Now, the importance of headlines is well established, and of course there's a reason that the popular press, the biggest newspapers, use headlines in a certain way. I should say before I discuss headlines that the actual content of the articles was heavily weighted towards the prosecution as well. But headlines have an instant impact that is well documented. So just a bit of text here explaining that people can make quick judgments or form initial opinions based on headlines. Headlines are designed to be attention-grabbing and often convey a specific message or perspective, which can influence how someone interprets the accompanying article or information. So we see a few reasons for this. Headlines create a first impression. Headlines can frame a story in a particular way, highlighting certain aspects and downplaying others, which can subconsciously influence the reader's perspective. Emotional impact. Headlines often use emotionally charged language or keywords to evoke a reaction, which can make it more likely that someone will engage with the story and form an opinion based on that emotional response. And by the way, YouTube literally requires you to do that. I've been learning YouTube over the last few months, and what I would typically write as a headline, or as a title, which would be quite sober, is just not what YouTube wants at all. So I've had to try to adapt to that. Emotional impact. Headlines often use emotionally charged language. Oh no, I just read that one, sorry. Cognitive shortcuts. Headlines can act as cognitive shortcuts, allowing people to quickly assess the importance or relevance of a piece of information without having to fully engage with the details. So all of those things collectively can have an enormous impact on people's perception or impression of something, even if they do read the article. But many times they're not reading the article. Not everyone went through all of the press coverage or all the BBC coverage of the Lucy Letby trial, reading every single article. Not that the articles were any less weighted towards the prosecution, but a lot of people will see the headline, Lucy Letby did this, Lucy Letby did that, this baby was perfectly fine, then it collapsed. So it's just the same thing, this relentless, perpetual pattern that you've seen in the articles that I've shown in this video. Well, that pattern went on to a very great extent in that precise fashion for months and months. So people that haven't read all the articles, and that obviously, as Dr. Evans will remind us on a regular basis, weren't in court, all a lot of people will see is the headlines, and all they will see is this pattern and this perpetual emphasis on the claims of the prosecution. So I just wanted to show a few academic examples of the impact of headlines. So there's a study here, Effects of Scanning Health News Headlines on Trust in Science and Emotional Framing Perspective. And this article concluded that these findings offer some support for the EFM, which was a model that they put together, and demonstrate that scanning headlines imbued with specific emotional frames can influence important health-related outcomes through the emotions they evoke. So that also mentions the emotional aspect of headlines. Obviously, that's very important. I think it's certainly in an article I'm going to show you in a second, but I think also here, they're suggesting that not only can it affect your point of view, but it can actually affect your own emotional state. Even your well-being, your health can be affected just by seeing headlines. So this was an article, ironically, on the BBC, how the news changes the way we think and behave. And in this, I'll just read this paragraph to you. It turns out that news coverage is far more important than a benign source of facts. From our attitudes to immigrants to the content of our dreams, it can sneak into our subconscious and meddle with our lives in surprising ways. It can lead us to miscalculate certain risks, shape our views of foreign countries, and possibly influence the health of entire economies. It can increase our risk of developing post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression. Now there's emerging evidence that the emotional fallout of news coverage can even affect our physical health, increasing our chances of having a heart attack or developing health problems years later. And the article goes on to say the following. After months of non-stop headlines about COVID-19, there are hints of an impending crisis of coronavirus anxiety. Many health charities across the world are reporting unprecedented levels of demand, while many people are taking social media holidays as they strive to cut their exposure to the news. I won't reflect on the irony of the BBC writing this particular paragraph. So there's another study here talks about this entitled "The Effects of Subtle Misinformation in News Headlines." So I'll just read the final sentence or the final little passage. On a theoretical level, we argue that these effects arise not only because headlines constrain further information processing, biasing readers towards a specific interpretation, but also because readers struggle to update their memory in order to correct initial misconceptions. Practical implications for news consumers and media literacy are discussed. So I think it's interesting they use that term media literacy because a lot of the population is not particularly media literate. I mean, I know my own family are very easily manipulated by the popular press. So a lot of people that are viewing these videos, I think, are media savvy and are very intelligent people. And I don't think it's even so much about being intelligent. It's more just a case of understanding the techniques that are used to manipulate public opinion. And as I say, my family are very naive about this, and you could basically make them believe anything, in my opinion. So what they're arguing here is that if you get this barrage of headlines, then even an astute person may struggle to actually maintain an objective view of that issue. So that again, that's why headlines are incredibly important. Apart from the emotion, the immediacy, and the immediate emotional impact. Also, over a period of time, they can really shape your view of a particular issue. So again, this is in the New Yorker, ironically, seeing as the New Yorker plays such an important part with Rachel Levie's article in the Lucy Letby case. So how headlines change the way we think, and there's just a kind of montage of different findings, why headlines matter, misleading headlines can lead you astray, how what you read affects what you see, how bad headlines make bad memories, 11 reasons headlines are important, you'll never believe how important an accurate headline is. So another one here, emotional news affects social judgments independent of perceived media credibility. So the final sentence here, these findings demonstrate that though we may have distinct perceptions about the credibility of media sources, information processing and social judgments rely on the emotional content of headlines, even when they stem from sources we distrust. So again, that is another article indicating you might see something in a newspaper or a media source that you don't particularly respect, but the headlines, particularly multiple headlines together along the same lines or in a similar tone, can completely override that and still change your perception about a particular issue. So this is another article about the influence of news headlines on well-being and emotional state. Furthermore, our study highlights the critical role of interest as a factor in news consumption. Interest significantly affects individuals' engagement and reactions to headlines, regardless of valence. So, important to note with this that a case such as the Lucy Letby case that involves infants, the horrifying crimes when you first hear about them, that inevitably leads to an elevated level of interest. You know, people think, "Oh my God, this is awful! What, a nurse has killed a load of babies? This is terrible." And this study concludes that has a big impact on the way that people engage with it. I'm sure people watching this video have encountered those that are determined to believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, although they're never able to put forward any rational arguments for this. In my experience, a lot of that is just purely based on their emotion. They're just so emotionally invested, and they have been since they first heard about the babies and Lucy and what allegedly happened at the hospital. So now they just literally can't think about it in a rational way. They think they're being rational, and that's the ironic thing is they don't know that they're not being rational, and it's impossible to make them look at it rationally. So I do intend to make a video about this, about why people still believe that she's guilty, even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, and a lot of it really comes down to emotion. There are other reasons as well, but emotion is a big factor in this. And headlines have an enormous impact on people's emotional response to an issue, particularly when it's an emotive issue such as this. So just read the final sentence. The findings underscore the complex interplay between headline content and reader engagement and stress the need for further research into how headlines are presented to protect individuals from potential emotional costs. So I won't go over this in depth, but I've asked ChatGPT this question about whether being in an emotional state has a significant influence on perception, judgment, and opinion on issues, particularly emotive issues. The answer to this question is very obvious, but ChatGPT concludes yes, being in an emotional state does significantly influence perception, judgment, and opinion, especially on emotive or controversial issues. This is well documented in psychological and neuroscience research. Here's a breakdown on the key findings. I want to emphasize at this point, while I remember, I've already mentioned this earlier in the video, but this was a key strategy of the prosecution, was to emotionally impact the jury so that they would view the allegations in a less rational way, essentially. So the comments, I won't read the whole thing, but emotion shapes perception and attention. Emotion affects cognitive processing and judgment. Emotions have an influence on moral or political judgment. There's a thing called mood congruent bias, which essentially means people are more likely to notice, remember, and believe information that matches their emotional state. So as soon as you become traumatized by the fact that babies have supposedly been harmed deliberately, you then remember all the information related to that, and you forget everything that clears the person. Emotion is a heuristic in opinion formation. When lacking information or motivation to think deeply, people use their emotional reaction as a shortcut to decide what they think, etc. Conclusion: emotional states don't just colour our experience, they systematically bias how we perceive, evaluate, and form opinions, especially on emotive or complex societal issues. This has serious implications for media, politics, public health messaging, and interpersonal conflict. The other question I'll just go over briefly is whether being in an emotional state makes people more suggestible. Again, this is very well established. Yes, being in an emotional state can make people more suggestible, but the effect depends on several factors, including the type of emotion, its intensity, and the context. Why emotions increase suggestibility, reduce critical thinking, increase focus on emotional cues, desire for relief or reassurance. So I think this one is critical here. So once you get into this emotional state, or once people got into this emotional state of Lucy Letby's harmed babies, these babies have been murdered, etc., etc., there's that desire for retribution or justice. So when she's locked away, people gain an emotional relief from that. And so that then colours the way they think about the issue going forward. So that's hugely significant. So another comment here, heightened trust in authority figures. And so it goes on discussing various aspects. But it's interesting here that they mention that anger might lead to more resistance and scrutiny, because I think this kind of explains some of the behaviour, as I say, of people who consider her to be guilty, that you'll see they can get quite angry at times. And I think that is because, as I say, they've made this emotional investment, and then, as it's stated here, anger leads to resistance and more resistance. So instead of engaging or thinking, right, well, I'll reassess what I believe on this topic, people instead become angry about the fact that people are questioning the fact that they've got retribution. Lucy Letby's locked away. You know, that's a closure, like an emotional closure. And people have a very strange attitude with this. Anyway, I don't want to go into this anymore because I will discuss this in depth in another video in the future. But the point is that headlines have an enormous impact on the way we perceive the world. The media clearly has an enormous, stupendous impact on people's perception of reality. Nowadays we're plugged into the media 24/7. People are carrying phones around constantly on media. It has an almost incalculable impact on people's perception of reality, on people's opinions, on people's sense of self, almost every aspect of our lives. So therefore the media has an enormous responsibility. And when you see an issue such as this, in which, as I've demonstrated, the BBC, in my estimation, produced coverage that was fundamentally biased and fundamentally imbalanced. It wasn't impartial. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't all the things that they're supposed to be. It was very heavily weighted in favour of the prosecution, and that has an enormous impact on public perception. And of course, you can argue that it even has an outcome on the trial itself. But certainly, it has a massive impact on public opinion. So one last section in this video is related to a book that was very much an inspiration for this video as a whole. But before I go into that, I just want to mention a related issue, which is this usage of the word denies. So I mentioned this earlier in the video. Now, note that they're saying Lucy Letby denies poisoning babies with insulin. So they're not saying Lucy Letby proclaims her innocence, or Lucy Letby proclaims that she didn't touch insulin, or anything, or something along those lines. It's not a positive from her perspective. It's her negatively denying. The word denial has negative connotations immediately. You know, being in denial, of course, is a negative thing. And I just want to show that this was used several times in headlines. So, Lucy Letby denies covering up murder of premature baby girl. So it almost sounds like, well, you know, she denies it, but really, actually, she did murder the premature baby girl. Lucy Letby denies poisoning babies with insulin. Lucy Letby denies rooting in bin after baby resuscitation. And we saw, both in headlines and in articles, this repeated use of the word denies. So this is another argument that's quite obvious again, but I've just asked ChatGPT here, do the words denies and denial have negative connotations? Yes, both denies and denial often carry negative connotations depending on context. And then immediately the AI technology uses the exact connotation and context from the Lucy Letby case. Denies, verb, negative connotation, often implies rejection, refusal, or suppression, sometimes in an accusatory or defensive tone. She denies the allegations, suggests potential wrongdoing or conflict. He denies responsibility, can imply avoidance or evasion. So immediately, by using those headlines in that manner, the BBC is creating negative connotations for Lucy Letby. Lucy Letby is professing her innocence. Lucy Letby is saying she never did anything wrong, whereas the BBC is saying, well, she denies the allegations. And then all the rest of the time, they're puffing up the prosecution case and the lawyers and the doctors and all of these trusted figures from the upper middle classes. And I think I do think it's quite systematic here. I don't think it's just, oh, this is an accident. This is, we've made a mistake. I think it's quite systematic. I do believe that to be the case. Now, what influence for me in examining this issue, and I feel I would have picked up on it anyway, but language is what I'm supposed to be competent at. So I'm supposed to understand these things. I'm supposed to pick up on these things. But I read this book, Manufacturing Consent, many years ago now, and it talks a lot about the way language is used by the mass media. It's obviously focused on the United States and how a lot of the book is about foreign policy, and about how when an enemy or an opponent of the United States engages in a certain activity, it's always described aggressively, or typically described aggressively, whereas when the United States does something, it's always described as responding to something, or it's like counterinsurgency. It's like a term, for example, that's used today, and so on. And so, in relation to this, what Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky attempted to do was develop a model to analyse the language that occurred in the American mass media. Now, I wasn't going to attempt something quite so ambitious for this video, but I just wanted to demonstrate the way that language is used is very important. And in those previous examples that I just showed you, the BBC had the opportunity to write something favourable towards Lucy Letby and essentially indicate that Lucy Letby was professing her innocence, but they couched it in such a way as to give a negative connotation to make her seem less trustworthy. So even when they're saying something that's in it, so when I give those statistics, about 80% of the headlines are against her, or at least 2/3 of them, a certain percentage are neutral. Even some of the headlines that are in her favour are not the headlines that are in favour of the prosecution are very strongly in favour of the prosecution, whereas some of the headlines in quote unquote in favour of Lucy Letby can still work against her because of the way that language is used. So some people would probably be resistant to the idea that the BBC has put out propaganda deliberately, and it's hard to explain exactly how it happens. I mean, it's suggested by Chomsky that people that are favourable to a certain perspective typically rise in these institutions, and those that aren't favourable learn to be favourable pretty quickly, or they don't advance. To what extent that is true, I don't know. And I don't really want to get into the deeper political aspects of this. I just wanted to explain that there is precedent for media quite systematically using language in a certain manner to curry your opinion. And I do believe that has occurred in this case. I think that the coverage, the coverage of the BBC was, not only was it strongly in favour of the prosecution, but when Lucy was given a chance to defend herself, they even tried to trample all over that and essentially piss all over it, really, by trying to influence the perception of the reader in the headline before they've even begun reading. So immediately they're making Lucy look like she's in denial before you even read a word, while at the same time battering you over the head with relentless pro-prosecution stuff and emotional stuff. And that is, I think, is pretty despicable, really. When you look back at the BBC coverage of this issue, I don't even the greatest defender of the BBC and even the person that most wants to believe that Lucy Letby is guilty would struggle to argue legitimately that it was fair, impartial, and balanced. Now, as I'm trying to suggest that the BBC coverage can reasonably be described as propaganda, I want to look at the 5 key ways that language is used to promote propaganda according to Chomsky's propaganda model. The first one is framing. The way news is presented, the angle taken, and the language used can subtly shape public perception. I think here there's nothing subtle about the language that was used and the angle of coverage. Lying by omission, leaving out certain information can create a misleading picture of events. Now, I would suggest that a lot of important context was left out of the BBC articles, which is important in itself, but also, as we saw when I looked at the articles for February and March, there really was a very limited coverage of the defence compared to the prosecution. And while that can reflect the court case to a certain extent, it doesn't properly reflect it because the defence was on the stand and speaking to people in the witness box and defending Lucy for a significant period of time. And as you can see in the BBC article, virtually none of that detail is there. Using loaded language. Words with strong positive or negative connotations can influence opinion. So that's particularly why I've showed you the stuff about denial and her denying things. So they're using words there with very negative connotations at a time when they could say something positive from Lucy's perspective to provide balance. Instead, they create a headline with negative connotations. Simplifying complex issues. Breaking down complex issues into easily digestible but often inaccurate narratives can mislead the public. I'd say that there is some element of that in the BBC coverage of the Letby case. I think it's the smallest one of the 5, but I do think there was a tendency to media generally will do that. Media will generally break down complex issues into digestible chunks. But the last one I think is equally as important as the language, and it is that repeating a specific narrative can make it seem more credible and ingrained in the public's mind. Now, you've seen the degree of repetition, you've seen the degree of reinforcement in the BBC coverage. I think it's absolutely undeniable that this was a significant factor in the public perception of this issue. So if you look at all those 5 things together, I think you'll see them across the BBC coverage of the Lucy Letby case, and they're all negative, because essentially this is what Chomsky uses to define propaganda and define the way that the media uses language to promulgate propaganda and influence the perception of the general public. And at least 4 of these are very strongly present in the BBC coverage of the Lucy Letby case, and I would say all 5 of them are present. And then when we consider the impartiality of the BBC, we shouldn't forget that the journalist who most prominently covered this court case for the BBC, although she didn't seem to write any of the reports about it, Judith Moritz, wrote this book with Jonathan Coffey, which is overwhelmingly favourable to the prosecution case, although it pretends otherwise. And it was going to be even more favourable to the prosecution case, but I think they realised they would look utterly ridiculous if they wrote Lucy is guilty and she's a terrible human being and there's no counter-arguments against this whatsoever book at the time that it came out. So they had to soften it a bit and try to make some kind of token effort to put in some counter-arguments. But if you read the book in its totality, it's very clearly pro-prosecution. So in conclusion, I want to remind people that the BBC is fundamentally supposed to be independent. It's supposed to be independent in all matters concerning the fulfilment of its mission and the promotion of public purposes. And its number 1 remit is to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. The BBC should provide duly accurate and impartial news, current affairs and factual programming to build people's understanding of all parts of the United Kingdom and the wider world. its content should be provided to the highest editorial standards, etc., etc. So I would strongly argue that the BBC failed in this remit. I don't see any evidence that its coverage of this issue was anything other than completely skewed towards the prosecution. Now, the reason I think this is particularly important is on your screen right now, is because the BBC literally gets as many visits as pretty much all the other UK media put together. It certainly gets 3 times more than the Daily Mail, which is by far the second highest, very comfortably the second highest visited media outlet in Britain, and nearly 4 times the Guardian. And it's just a country mile ahead of anyone else. I think if you add everything up together, what does it add up to? About 700, 800 million. So the BBC is getting 75, 80% the visits of the other top 9 media combined every day. So I can't remember over what period of time this 574 million visits applies, but I think it's daily. But it's an enormous number of people are reading BBC content every day and engaging with BBC services. And that is reflected in the fact that approximately 91% of UK adults use BBC television, radio, or online services every week. So given that they're supposed to be independent, given the fact they're supposed to be impartial, given the fact that they're given billions of pounds of public money every year, and given the fact that the overwhelming majority of adults in the country are using BBC services every week, and given the fact that their website is viewed by more than any other news site, threefold more than the Daily Mail, which is the second highest, they have an enormous responsibility. And in my estimation, they have just completely and utterly failed in the Lucy Letby case, not only to give a fair, impartial and balanced perspective, but also they were one of the very last media outlets to actually acknowledge there were problems with the case. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the discussion after all manner of publications. I could have taken the time to work out every single publication that spoke about this issue before then. But it's at least a dozen, and it's possibly even more than that if you take into account radio stations, online, internet and television stations. It's just literally everyone was talking about it, and literally everyone had written about it, and the BBC were just desperately trying to avoid doing so. And I think the simple reason for that, as I mentioned at the start of this video, is that they just do not want to do anything that will upset the establishment. The reason they don't want to do that is because they want to retain the licence fee. And they just think, if we say something that's inconvenient for the establishment, they can say, right, well, we're not really going to review the licence fee, we're not going to give you a royal charter, you can try and compete in the commercial marketplace. And I'm sure that their revenue would decrease quite significantly. Or if people had to pay for BBC services, would you pay to see Homes Under the Hammer? I ask myself. Probably not. So I think it is a kind of survival instinct that they have, and they've just become weaker and weaker and weaker and more pro-establishment, and that is absolutely reflected in this case. But regardless of the reasons for why they gave such a skewed series of reporting on the Lucy Letby case, the fact that the coverage is indeed completely imbalanced, completely biased towards the prosecution is just simply undeniable. And that must have had an enormous impact on the public perception of this issue because, as we know, it's the most visited website. It's the biggest news outlet in Britain by a considerable distance. And therefore, as I say, they have such a huge responsibility, and I think their coverage of this issue was frankly despicable. So that's all I have to say in this video. It could have been quite a bit shorter, but I really wanted to go into this issue in depth because it's a strong view, but I think it's something that needs to be put out there because they should be held responsible for what they've done. They should be held responsible for promoting the fact that this, in my view, completely blameless woman is now in prison for 15 life sentences, and they'll never accept any responsibility for it. When this is finally overturned, and when people finally, whenever that is, hopefully it's going to be sooner rather than later, But when it does happen, they will pretend like they were the architects of it. They will come out. Judith Moritz will come out and say, "Oh, of course, I went to court every day and I reported on it for the BBC and I wrote a book about it." She won't say that she was basically a cheerleader for the prosecution. She won't talk about that. So I felt that they really needed to be skewered properly, and hopefully I've done that in this video. So if you have any queries, comments, questions, observations, corrections, or anything else, please do contact me. I really appreciate all the support, and I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say.